Hey folks, this is Chris with the Human Project Podcast. In this episode, we're going to talk about what is our mental scorecard? What are the things that we look at that help us determine whether we are being successful or not? And Mark and I get very, very vulnerable in this episode, actually working this out, debating this amongst ourselves, thinking through this. So take a listen. I hope and trust that it's valuable for you as you're asking this question of yourself. What does success look like in my life? Let us know what you think, and we'll see you after the episode. Hi, Mark.
Hey, Chris.
How are you today?
Swell. How are you?
Swell. I am doing really well. By all measures of success, I am doing great.
All measures of success.
All measures of
wow.
success.
So you got like a dashboard on your car or something. You're
exactly.
Seeing all the positive indicators. Okay.
Yeah, it's true. It's this was one of our smoother segues, I think.
If you have to point it out, I think it kind of loses its power.
This has been a topic that's been on my mind a lot, is what is my mental scorecard? And I was reading a book.
I'm just so terribly surprised by the beginning of that sentence.
I had to pause for you to say it. I've been reading a book called The Scarcity Brain. I talked about a book a while ago called The Comfort Crisis. It's by the same author, Michael Easter. And the book wasn't as good as this first one, but this is not a book review podcast. Or is it? It's the book review podcast.
Oh my goodness.
We're reviewing the book. But in Scarcity Brain, he's talking about this habit loop that we fall into. And it's got a lot of really good points. But what really stuck out with me the most was him talking about how do we measure and view success. And it's something that's always going on in the back of my mind. And I'm always trying to figure this out. Like, what does good look like? What does the good life look like? What's God calling us into? How do I know that I'm doing what God wants me to do?
Yes.
This classic dependence and duty, responsibility thing. And it really got me thinking, like, what is my mental scorecard? Because it's really easy for us to fall into this quantitative trap where we need to measure everything and use that as our measure of something is good or bad. Like, we've dealt with this a lot in the corporate world.
Yeah, I think we've dealt with a wide range of leaders who do no measurement, for example, and are just leading by what we might call gut on any sort of measurement or thinking about what does success mean, either because they're so confident that they know what it is, or they're just they just gut, or just kind of feeling their way through it, all the way to people who are measuring an insane amount of things, just to the point of being overbearing, extremely expensive, and useless, basically.
Right.
But yeah, we've kind of experienced all of that gamut, and I think, to your point, it kind of applies in some ways, in principle, to us in our lives as well.
Yeah, I think for a lot of those leaders, the mantra is inspect what you expect. And so they're saying, here's the goals, and we're going to continuously look at those to track and see our progress against those. And I think that's crept into individuals' personal lives, as well as even into the church and ministry as a whole.
Sure.
I think the danger that we have when we're trying to think of what is the human project, what is EMI, what is God asking us to do, is we tend to fall into this trap of success by worldly measures. Like, and part of it is like the fruit is good. Like, more people listening to the podcast and hopefully getting value out of the conversations that we have, more people attending classes and saying, yes, this was life-changing for me, or this was helpful and changed my relationships, my marriage, whatever. All those are awesome.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to become convinced that's not the whole picture. And I feel like I'm falling into this trap of getting distracted by measures. Like, what would it look like if I threw all that stuff out the window and then just moment by moment asked, what does obedience to God look like right now? Not to tie it back to the 90s fad of the WWJD bracelets, but what would that look like if you were to stop and pause everything and say, if Jesus were in my shoes right now, what would he do as a result of what's going on? And so I'm trying to change and not go off of this scorecard metric for my life. But what does obedience look like?
I'm reminded of course, taking it back to Jesus. It seems to be my theme of the episodes lately. But what was he doing? And of course, I could be all cutesy and say like Jesus didn't keep a balanced scorecard and blah blah blah. Okay. Yeah, that's just kind of a
They didn't take attendance at the feeding of the 5,000.
Right. That's just kind of a straw man argument. That's kind of unhelpful, humorous though I would say, which is why I said it. But no, truly, what is he looking at? And I mean, he recognizing he's God.
Yeah.
Also, in this, but what are the things that he's doing? What are the practices he's doing that help him understand what he's to do next? What direction, right? Strategically and tactically he's trying to undertake.
Yeah.
And there are two things that pop out to me. One of them is he seemed to be able to articulate in the moment his mission. Now, admittedly, it's a little different in different places when he says it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I mean, I have my own favorite, to seek and save the lost. Yeah. That's one of my favorites, definitely.
Mine's that they might have life and have it more abundantly.
Right.
John 10:10. Yep.
So they're different, and you can study them and find. I tend to find they're all different aspects of of the same direction.
Facets on a diamond.
That's what I was trying to say. Thank you.
I got you, buddy.
But I think the first thing is that he understands the overarch. He's got his overarch, and he also understands it in its context at the moment. How he does that, I think, is partly the second one, which also takes us down to tactics. And in John, he says, I'm going to be casual in my quotation here, so pardon me for not being precise, but I'm just doing what I see my Father doing. Mm. It's kind of how he describes it to the people around him. Is like, I'm just doing what Dad's doing. Is kind of a really, really casual way of interpreting that. And you're like, so the way he knows what to be about is because of his deep connection with his Father.
Yeah.
That he's just got enough relational history with his Father that he goes, oh, Dad's over there. And off he goes.
Yeah.
Like that. Oh, wow. What would it be like to steer life like that, where God's giving us missional perspective and contextually missional perspective, right? In this moment, seek and save the lost. In this moment, give life abundantly. And then where is that? Oh, God's over here. He's pointing my focus right over there. I'm going to go over that direction.
Yeah. I've heard John Piper describe that as ballast. Like if we are a ship going through the ocean, these waves are going around and we're like leaning back and forth. What ballast is in a boat is it's anchoring it down. It's weighing it down so that the waves have less of an impact on it. And so the ballast is like, what is clarity? What is that mission? What does that look like for me in this moment?
So that's what we're pulling against is the waves being tossed about in the waves or the wind. So we're not swayed by, things like metrics that might not be what God really is caring about or asking us to look at.
Yeah.
Or people trying to, tell us what should be important to us. Yeah. This can act like ballast against that.
Yeah. I think like if we were to zoom out, let me give some examples. Like it doesn't matter how many podcast listeners we have. It doesn't matter how many people come to the next class that we have. It doesn't matter how much in monthly donations we're getting. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter how many zeros are in our bank account. It doesn't matter for those people that might want to be in a relationship but aren't. Like these are all the metrics in the scorecard that we hold for ourselves. Like what would it look like to throw all that out the window? And the goal of what I hear you saying is like being so connected to who God has made us to be and called us to be that everything else kind of just falls off on the wayside. Am I hearing that accurately?
There's an aspect of it I will agree heartily with, and an aspect of it I would hold with caution because, I'm a balanced analyst kind of person here. That yes, absolutely and wholeheartedly, everything pales in comparison to God, who he is and what he calls us to do in his kingdom. And I would be cautious saying things like, none of that matters. What I would say is, it is, and I'm fine with it punching, but I guess what I would say is that that's not the thing. It's not that they have no meaning or value whatsoever. It's that they are servants to, at best, they are servants to the bigger value. the bigger point here, which is the kingdom. So dollars in a bank account, they are or they're not, right? So they matter when they matter and they don't when they don't, but that's not my job to figure that out. My job is to work, right? The kingdom purposes that God calls me to.
I'm really struggling with it because so much of what we talk about in the business world is getting people to stop measuring like the things that don't matter and only measure the things that do matter.
Right.
So we'll talk about the difference of activities, like the things you do, outputs, the things you produce, outcomes being the result or like the change in like your customer's behavior.
The effect of what you've produced. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like so used to like having this pitch about measuring outcomes that I'm trying to internalize that for myself. And I think they're very different contexts, like a business context versus me partnering with God context. And so maybe it's not so much about the outcomes or the outputs of what's produced, but it's more about the motivation, going back to the themes of the last couple episodes, but more about the motivation of the inputs.
Okay.
Like, what does obedience look like? And so, like, extreme example.
Yeah.
There's lots of stories about different missionaries that this has been like a story for. One is Dr. William Leslie. He was a missionary to parts of the jungle in Africa in like the 1920s. And a recent group went out, I think like in the 90s, went out and thought that they were reaching people that had never been reached. And they find these self-sustaining church communities that have been there for years. And they all credit back and have oral history of Dr. William Leslie. But from what they knew, he never saw any fruit or as a result of that.
Okay.
But it was there. Like, what if that was my story? Would I be okay with that? Like, what if I was doing all this work and my motivation, my obedience, my aim is like, yes, God, I want you to be magnified. I want you to be held in the glory that you deserve. Moment by moment interaction, all of the results of my effort and strategy and thinking going towards that. But I don't ever see it. Like, how do I reconcile that scorecard? And just for those of you listening, this is actually something I'm wrestling with right now. So
it's
hoping Mark has the perfect answer.
Then you are hoping in vain, my friend.
But this is us wrestling through these things together.
This is not why we
I do not
talk
expect
about
you to
these
have the
things.
perfect answer.
It's because we're wrestling through these things that we talk about them.
Yeah.
Because they're very real. And if we're going through it, then I think we're believing that God's able to use that for other people if he wants to. So that's why we're offering it humbly. I would, I'll just share what came to mind as you were sharing that too, is that like a parent, my highest hope, and I imagine yours and Derek's as well, that our kids would grow up to be children of God, to be followers of Jesus, and to be walking after him in ways that we're describing even in this very episode.
Seeing him for how wonderful he is. Yes.
And if I take your hypothetical there, which is not, hypothetical for all, but if we take your hypothetical there, what if we invest rightfully years of our lives in parenting our kids, and then they walk away and we die without knowing whether that's borne fruit in their lives? That's tough. I'm just like, that's really, really deeply challenging.
Yeah. It's terrifying, I would actually say. Yeah.
And I think really, for me anyway, puts a push on the pain, on the bruise of this. How much am I trusting that this is what God's called me to? And that there's a reality here, for example, back in the kids example here, they're actually his children. And I'm never going to do it perfectly anyway. And I'm never going to be able to control that outcome. And I've seen parents try to control the outcome of their kids following Jesus. Some of them succeed and some of them fail much worse than parents who do not try to enforce it, try to demand compliance. Sometimes it goes horribly wrong.
Sure. Yeah.
It's God's. It's in his hands. And that's a really, really difficult thing to see as a parent. That's probably one of the more challenging things for me as a parent, is why I bring that as an example. But what's my call is to be faithful. That's a difficult thing in the moment, to look at, but how am I faithful to parent in a godly way?
Yeah.
And I'm going to have to keep trying to open my hands off of the results, because that's not something I can force. But to even get to the spot where you're coming from and saying, my success is that I was faithful.
Yeah. And that's I think that's a really, really good way of putting it. Because I think about the parable of the talents. So one of the parables you and I love to reference. What does Jesus say to the servants that did well? Well done, my good and faithful servant.
Yeah.
And I think we landed at the same spot of dependence and duty, of talking about, like, at some point it is, we are just trusting God with our actions. That's what it boils down to. And the only way we can do that is through being obedient in what he calls us to, of developing a relationship with him, being in community, looking at the world the way that he wants us to look at it, doing the things he has commanded us to do, abstaining from the things he has commanded us not to do, and then acting out of the overflow of that. And that's faith. That's being full of faith. So I think, going back to my hypothesis at the beginning of this, the scorecard isn't the outcomes that are produced or the outputs that are produced. It is solely the input, reactions to that.
Super countercultural. I think you know that.
Yeah. Oh, I love the countercultural stuff.
Well, I think about that from a ministry perspective. So I'll give you this challenge, because this is a real wrestle. I have not landed anywhere on this either. I like your challenge, and it is challenge. I have not landed on it. But if I look at it from a ministry perspective, or let's say a church or something, as I'm kind of reporting to the people who are supporting us, here's what you have given to, and I'm reporting, we faithfully recorded a podcast.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And this is an honest statement. I'll say that's not how it's done today. That doesn't make it
Right.
right or wrong. It's
Right.
just like, that's not how it's done today. Marketing is you tout the results.
Yeah. 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 That's a very, very good description. Marketing. So let me challenge your challenge.
Yeah.
Then, like I said, this is all real stuff we're talking through for the first time on the podcast. So some of this might get edited out depending on how much we want to market and
You
how
said what?
real we want to be. Yeah. But at some point, like, is that marketing us trusting in our ability to market, or is that trusting in God's faithfulness?
And I think there's this, we're back in this spot of, maybe not back in this spot. It feels like we're a false choice almost that we're presenting ourselves with.
Sure. Yep.
That we also wrestled through in the responsibility dependence continuum there, that we still have a responsibility. It's just, what is that? Yeah. And we still have dependence. And what is that?
Wait a second. I'm trying to get to a black and white answer and you're trying to find the gray. This is different than normal.
Wait, let me get a book reference out here just a second.
And then you just got to put a little jingle together.
No, I'm going to stick with the book reference.
So all joking aside,
yeah,
your goal was to take us back to that dependence and duty responsibility, not just being a false choice, but I'm guessing where you were going was tying those things together, and it's a yes and.
There's some yes and. There's some balance of the two in there is what it feels like to me. I don't have much of a basis for that, admittedly, so I'm not trying to make a strong biblical case for that, but it feels like there's some manner of balance that would be healthy in that, but I don't know what that is. And that could just be me wanting to reconcile the two so that I feel better about my current ethics of this. But yeah, that's what's crossed my brain at the moment.
Yeah, I think what it boils down to for me, like you tying it back to faithfulness, I think was a really, really good, helpful way for me to think about it of like, yes, can I look at the fruit and can I look and see what God's producing and that helps give me confidence? Mm-hmm. Yes, but confidence in what, I think is the question.
Okay.
Confidence in the work that I am doing or confidence in the work of what God is doing.
Okay.
That's it. Like we talked about the Paul and Apollos,
right? All
of that. Like it's God that gives the increase. Mm-hmm. So if we tie it back to marketing or what God is doing, I think that's how we can be authentic, God honoring, and it not be about us and what we're producing. That's the scorecard. I think that's the scorecard. What is God doing? God, what are you up to? What do you want me to know? All of those questions.
Yeah.
And less around, here's what I'm producing. Here's the work of what I'm doing. The only thing that matters for me and my perspective is the input. And I can look and see what's the output of what God is producing.
Boy, that's a really short trip, isn't it? Between I've taken an action and I see what I think is a result of that action. Look at what I did.
Oh, dude, yes.
That trip is like split second fast. Because
Yeah.
I'm thinking about marketing stuff. And even this week I'm looking at myself going, I haven't done much social media of anything for EMI lately, right? And we haven't put out too many emails of promotion and stuff. And like, oh man, but if we did that and we'd gotten signups, I would have been like, man, my social media is good, right? Just that fast. But the question of constantly asking God, what are you up to? What are you blessing? What direction do you want us to go? Man, if I put it in business terms, this is like anti-empirical.
Yeah.
Right.
Or to take it off of the nerdy term that we love to talk about with businesses, like feedback loops.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's exactly it. That to me is what the scorecard is. Is it's a quick feedback loop for me to feel good about the actions that I'm doing.
Okay.
And that's very, very self-reliant. What I'm trying to talk myself into is essentially what this podcast
How's
is.
that going for
this
you?
episode is. What I'm trying to talk myself into is like, yes, look at the feedback loop from a perspective of confidence in what God is doing and that's working from him. But there's going to be times that like God calls us to do something, that we are obedient in doing something, and we see absolutely no reward. It could even be a punishment, quote unquote, of what we would think of for that. Like, look at all these missionary examples. Like, they spent years and years and years and years of their life in something. And you hear stories about, like, there's entire tribes that come to know Jesus as a result of that, but they never got to see that.
Yeah.
Like, our feedback loop could be never. Or when we get to heaven and we get to see the result of that.
That is very challenging to consider.
Yeah.
And so in light of that, like, what do we do? And the only thing that seems to be landing for me in this conversation right now is the constant conversation with God and that connection with him, to be able to ask him regularly, repeatedly, constantly, continually. What other words can I use here to emphasize? What are you up to? Where do you want me focused? What do you have your hand on? And try and get his perspective on things, so that if there's no fruit, but he's called me to it, can I be satisfied in that? I want to be. If he's called me to it and there is fruit, can I be satisfied in him and not in my effort equal results? Right? I can be satisfied in the fruit that he produced instead of in what I think I produced. And I don't see any way to get there except that constant refining communication and connection with God.
And community. Yes, to that.
Oh,
and community.
We haven't said community yet.
Yeah, I know. We haven't brought community into this one yet. But I think that's a big part of it. Like, I think that is why I'm really excited that you and Christine and Victoria and I are moving forward with this together, as well as the wonderful people we have on the board, as well as our wonderful volunteers. Like, all of these are feedback loops for us that are people that love Jesus, are passionate about the work that is going on. But all of that is there to help give outside perspective beyond what we're thinking about by ourselves.
Yeah.
So,
other people who are ideally, and I believe, listening to God and asking those same questions. God, what are you up to? Where are we headed?
Yeah. I don't exactly know where to land this episode at a full, what's the word? Full transparency.
Transparency. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know exactly where to land this episode at a full transparency. So I'll just say this. I'm feeling led to ask this in this moment. If you're listening to this episode, we would really appreciate prayer for wisdom. Just what is our responsibility as leaders of EMI, of the Human Project? Just pray for us. Give us wisdom, because we ultimately want to be serving what God's scorecard is, not our own.
Right.
So that's my ask. That's the only ask for this episode. So thanks for listening to us explore that. Mark, thank you for exploring that with me, buddy. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you too, man.
Yeah. Cool. Well, this feels like a weird way to end the episode, but thank you. Just thank you for listening to this. I hope it's valuable for you and your things that you're wrestling with in your life as well. It's probably one of the most vulnerable episodes we've had. So please treat that with love. That's my ask.
Indeed.
So thanks, and we'll see you next episode. Hey folks, thanks for tuning in today. Our team is made up of myself, Chris Conlin, and Mark Wavle, and our lead editor is Derek Donley. We're a crowd-funded nonprofit. Our free resources exist because of your generous support. To learn more about us or to check out classes that we talk about here, visit us at www.humanproject.us. Thanks for joining us on our mission to bring 1 million lives closer to the fullness of God's design.